see, your son, the one at law school, what'd you say, Harvard?
Yes, Harvard. He's 22.
Not much difference, but a lot of difference, right? Think I could have gotten through law school?
Yes.
But you still don't think I can handle my own case?
Well, it's not just knowing everything in the books. It's like music. It's the difference between understanding it and being able to play it.
That's not an answer.
No. I don't think you can handle your own case.
Well, I do.
Well, I tried. But he wasn't much of a help. Ultimately, we're going to need a witness who's seen more than just a puff of smoke, heard the shot. What about that young Negro woman? Claims she saw a man with a rifle in the bushes, doesn't she?
I don't know. Some of the others on the grass, said she said something like that.
Oh, she did. She saw that.
Play now?
Okay. Checking the gray.
Just trying to make sure there's no boyish charm left.
It's time once again for Dialogue Conspiracy with Mae Brussell. For the past 14 years, Mae has been researching and uncovering facts and evidence from between the lines of the news and placing them in a more thorough perspective of how conspiracy, political assassination, and abuses of power affect us all. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB-FM in Carmel, California. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. It's October 16th, 1977, and this Dialogue Conspiracy number 291. I received a long letter from a woman who's a regular listener to Dialogue Conspiracy in Sacramento. She listens to KZAP up there. And she asked me a question which I get sometimes on other radio shows and in the mail. She asked me, why worry about the murder of John Kennedy that I dwell upon so much? That people assume that there's a conspiracy there and go on to other important problems. She said, in fact, John Kennedy is dead. You can get into a rut, and you can go into other matters. And the answer that I want to give her on the air expresses my feelings about why I go into the John Kennedy assassination so much. As far as I'm concerned, it epitomizes the transference in the United States of power in a way that obviously implicates all the major agencies of the federal and state government. This came out at the time of Watergate, but it was very obvious at the time John Kennedy was killed that the CIA is involved, the FBI is involved, the State Department, the Internal Revenue Service, Immigration Department, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the new President of the United States, the Chiefs of Police, the Governor of Texas, the District Attorney in Texas, the Sheriff's Department, the Attorney General. All agencies that touched the matter were part of a cover-up. And when our system breaks down that way, it's impossible to get back on your feet and get to the matters that this person would like to be delving into. The entire news media, the press, the national media, the Associated Press, United Press, CBS, NBC, Reuters, Radio Free Europe, U.S. Information Service have all been the tools of the CIA, and nothing was more flagrant or obvious than at the time John Kennedy was killed. The Washington Post, the New York Times, Saturday Evening Post, these newspapers have been named in Rolling Stones and new CIA articles, documents as being part of a large branch of the Central Intelligence Agency, all the major media of the United States, starting in 1947. And this flagrant abuse of truth and honesty or giving you the facts in the case is so flagrant in the John Kennedy assassination that if they could do this over the murder of a president, they will distort any other news, whether it's kidnappings or stock market affairs or regarding our health or pollution or any other matter. It meanders to me that the investigation should pursue because the same people that were involved in the killing of John Kennedy and covering it up, such as Allen Dulles, who was director of the CIA and then on the Warren Commission, also were part of forming our news media after World War II that became the tool of the Central Intelligence Agency and didn't belong to the people. The same people are involved in altering our minds surgically, electronically, through drugs. They're polluting our rivers, our oceans. They're making people impotent and sterile through their chemicals, importing massive narcotics into the cities and into the schools. They stockpile gas, water, electricity from the masses and increase their huge profits and give us a few commercial public broadcasting ballet shows or opera to justify the grab for the profit of these things. And many people will feel the effects as the winter goes on in the next few years and the shortage of the fuel that you need to keep warmer to get your car going or for transportation. They have the capability of causing famines and floods. They can cause strikes to type the entire country. They can kill off political opponents all over the world, and they're doing it every week. The head of Yemen and his brother were killed this week when they were making overtures somewhat to the left in their country. They can arm Africa and Middle East and turn into a bloodbath like they did in Vietnam. And when it was over, they said Vietnam was an error, and then escalate these wars to other continents and begin to arm these poor people, shooting each other, not knowing why. They're going to deprive citizens of retirement, of security, their savings, low-cost housing. And I believe that the culprits into all of these things have names and that they are linked over and over again to the John Kennedy assassination, and they appear through the history up through Watergate, and the same culprits are at work. An example is that Scripps Howard correspondent Seth Kantor, who was in Dallas at the time John Kennedy was killed. At 2:45, he calls his Washington office, and he gets a message from Hal Hendricks in Miami. And Hal Hendricks already knows about Lee Harvey Oswald before anyone else. He identifies him by name. He tells the major media he's a Castroite. And then later Hendricks is identified as a CIA agent who becomes a top executive for ITT. And then he later goes on to Chile at the time of the coup when Salvador Allende was murdered. So that these dogs don't stop with one feet, they keep going on. I read this week that Salvador Allende's daughter commits suicide, Beatriz Allende, over the death of her father. Maybe she killed herself with a gun. Maybe she was killed in silence. They said that she's been depressed since her father died. There's also a news bulletin that the American journalists are investigating the death of Charles Horman, who was in Chile at the time that Allende was killed, and he was murdered down there. And the list of deaths on the hands of these people runs into the hundreds and maybe the thousands, not counting the war deaths after the escalation of Vietnam. So the answer, why do I keep pursuing the killing of John Kennedy? Because there are many people alive who are still overthrowing governments, lying, polluting, and stealing from us. And when we investigate this assassination thoroughly and then go to the murder of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and into the Chappaquiddick affair or the shooting of George Wallace and further into Watergate, maybe we can purge ourselves of these people so that we can get on to the business of doing the things that we should be doing and enjoying on planet Earth. Now I'm going to switch to a list of articles. You might get a pencil because I don't have time to go into these at length with you. They're new articles that are out, and because of the shortage of the program with 15 minutes cut off, I can't go into every detail about them. But New Times article, November the 7th, has 1977, has an article about Alger Hiss by Fred Cook. And it has to do with new documents telling about the framing of Alger Hiss. And this is a very important article because it goes into the Nazi double agent, a man who worked for the OSS and Adolf Hitler's army, who was involved in the framing of Alger Hiss. And that's important because I believe I'm the only published person, at least that I know of, I haven't seen any articles, suggesting that Whittaker Chambers was sent over here in 1938 to discredit Alger Hiss. I wrote that in my article in 1972, How Nixon Came to Power, that was part of my Watergate story. And I said that the real story of Alger Hiss was that he was framed because he was carrying a book, The Merchants of Death, to the Senate hearings and was purposely exposing the rearmament of Germany, and that he was set up for that purpose. And now that it seems that an agent of Adolf Hitler's was in the United States and preparing to discredit Alger Hiss and the whole war movement, and then President Truman, when he defeated Dewey as president of the United States, and smear that administration as being communist. There's also an article out in the Philadelphia magazine this last month, September 77, marvelous article, and it goes into the Philadelphia connections, the John Kennedy assassination, which include George DeMohrenschildt and Ruth Paine and Sylvia Odio and Frank Sturgis. And there's a whole list of people involved in the Kennedy assassination that came from Philadelphia, and CIA foundations and Nazi connections, again, hardcore Nazi connections to George DeMohrenschildt, and that again will tie into Ruth Paine. Try and get a hold of that magazine. It's not the easiest thing to get, but I think I brought the address here. I'll look it up for Philadelphia Magazine. Yes, I have it. If you have a pencil, write to 1500 Walnut Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania 19102. There also is a new article out, We Magazine, on the Mormon Church. This is October 77. So be sure to get the New Times article on Alger Hiss. And then there's the We Magazine. It's called The Latter-Day Intrigue of the Mormon Church. Watergate, CIA, Howard Hughes, Cuban exiles, big business, and data banks. That sounds up my tree for those of you that know the programs here on Dialogue Conspiracy. Again, the highlight of that article, written by Jim Coastman, J.C. Lewis, and Harvey Yasinian, is the forming of the secret army organization in San Diego and the links of the Mormons to the secret army organization, because that is the group that was going to plan to kill Richard Nixon at the time of the conventions in 1972. And then it goes into the formation of the Mullen Associates and the CIA front in Washington, D.C. that was named at the time of Watergate, and they're putting Agnew into office, promoting Spiro Agnew, because that was the intended plan, to kill Richard Nixon and make Agnew vice president, and then the Watergate intervened and stopped that process. This article is an important article, and be sure and get that. We Magazine, November 1977. Gallery Magazine has an article this month, November 77 also. There's a lot of good material out by Mark Lane. It's about George DeMohrenschildt, and I'm interested in that article. There's a lot of good material on the links of DeMohrenschildt to the German Nazis again. And, of course, this is a journalism first, that when I wrote that the assassination had to do with Nazification of America and the actual German Nazis that were brought to this country, you begin to pick up some more pieces about DeMohrenschildt. Of course, there's a quotation in that article. It said, George DeMohrenschildt told Mr. Altman, that's the Dutch journalist, in quotes, I'm very much afraid of the investigation of Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, because I believe he was on the right track. I left here in September 1967 and went to New Orleans at my own expense. Jim Garrison wanted to pay me for the trip, and I wanted to make that little contribution to my country, and went there for the express purpose of telling Jim Garrison of the links of George DeMohrenschildt and Ruth Paine to the Kennedy assassination, to the motorcade, and to his arrest of Clay Shaw. That's why I went there. And when I walked in Jim Garrison's office after flying to New Orleans and going down to the DA's office, an investigator was in there by the name of Mark Lane. And Mark Lane was furious that I came to New Orleans. That's the first time I had seen him personally. I had spoke to him in 1964. This was 1967. And he was so angry that I was bringing the connections of George DeMohrenschildt and Ruth Paine to the Kennedy assassination investigation of Garrison that he walked out of the room, discredited me with Jim Garrison, smeared my name around the country, and now in 1977, that's 10 years later, he's writing articles saying that until George DeMohrenschildt died in 77, few Americans ever heard of him. It was because of Mark Lane that I was not allowed to get to more people on more lecture forums and talk about DeMohrenschildt. But in spite of the fact of my differences with this terribly obnoxious person, the information which he has is good and it's worthwhile, and you should read the article. It's very important. It's just tragic that it's 10 years later, because we could have done a lot in those 10 years. As I say, the Mormon article in We, the Gallery Magazine, on George DeMohrenschildt, the Philadelphia article is important, and the Alger Hiss in the New Times. That's your homework for this week. And one other article, which isn't in the national magazine, but which is in the newspaper, the Las Vegas Sun and the New York Times this week, is that a Las Vegas federal grand jury is going to probe who gave drugs to Howard Hughes. The grand jury wants to determine there's a Federal Controlled Substance Act, and 10 to 15 men were in charge of Howard Hughes. The penalties could be up to 20 years in prison. They're getting subpoenas on the doctors. 3 doctors are named, Dr. Norman Crane, Dr. Wilbur Thane, and Dr. Homer Clark. The crime was getting prescriptions without the name of the person. You can't get it under another person's name. And if they were prosecuted, they could get up to 20 years. Seeing the Watergate sentences, I doubt if they'll get anything. But that is moving along because Howard Hughes was not only drugged, but as I said, I believe he was dead for quite a while, and I published that in 1974. Well, I want to spend the next 15 minutes on the CIA and the news media because the news media is the source of our information. Unless we have alternative radios like Dialogue Conspiracy and FM radio stations or talk shows that allow people to be heard, there is no way to get to the large mass of American population. And the CIA news media have covered that up pretty tight. There was an article in April 1977 called "The Man Who Called Walter Cronkite a Spy" by Taylor Branch. And this is an excellent article. It was given to me by John Judge in Philadelphia, who also sent me the Philadelphia links to the John Kennedy assassination. This article said, at January 23, 1976, Walter Cronkite was on the radio in his sanctimonious voice saying that a few phony journalists cooperate with the U.S. government, but they were spoiling his honorable profession. And he named Sam Jaffe, who is a big mouth, and who was spoiling the profession. And Sam Jaffe got back at Walter Cronkite by saying that there is hard evidence that he works with the CIA and has been a CIA person all of his radio time. Sam Jaffe was charged of being a Russian spy for ABC Broadcasting in 1969. He went to the CIA and FBI and said, "No, you know I was an agent for you. I'm not a Russian spy," at which time they said, "We can't give you any of your papers on national security because you are on the periphery of everything from the Kennedy assassination to secret spy murders." January 23, 1976, as I say, he appeared on a Washington talk show, Sam Jaffe, and he said, "There are many important informants working for the CIA, more important than him. Mr. John Chancellor is on the list. Walter Cronkite is on the list. William Sheehan of ABC, Mr. Lou Cioffi of ABC." And he went on to say there are between 40 and 200 names. This was in January of 76 that he was on the air saying this in Washington, D.C. in a talk show. The response was, according to Mr. Jaffe, all hell broke out. And I think this was the baby of the Carl Bernstein article that came out in New Times just October 1977, was to answer the Esquire article and cover it up and put everything just about in the past tense when we know it's still going on. Carl Bernstein was in Navy intelligence and got $30,000 for the New Times article, which tells us a lot about the Church Committee, but it still covers up a lot. Sam Jaffe said that the Senate committee, Senator Church's committee, was a big cover-up, that there are lists of agents that work with the news media, that Richard Nixon had these names and used them as ammunition and blackmail against the press corps. He went on to say that the CIA was formed in 1947 and the national TV was formed in 1947, if you think about it. And the networks were set up at the same time as the Cold War. There were spies working for the CIA. They gave the journalists their stories, and the journalists gave the CIA their information, and the top brass worked hand in glove. He said that the New York Times sent Mr. Sulzberger, and CBS sent William Paley and Walter Cronkite, and they met with George Bush and top CIA officials who suppressed the Church Committee. And now this was written in Esquire, April 77, and confirmed again in the Bernstein article for New Time. Not for the Rolling Stones, rather. It was the Rolling Stones article, October the 4th, 1977. He went on to talk about CBS with Eric Severoid getting on the air sanctimoniously and putting down the thought that news people would have a witch hunt now that the Jaffe story was out. He was protecting himself because they tried to make him look like a Russian agent, and he was working for CBS and the Associated Press. Over in Europe, he was not a Russian spy. Sam Jaffe was working for the CIA and the FBI. The man who replaced Sam Jaffe is named John Scaley. He got all the lead stories in 1962 from the CIA to make him famous. In 65, he broke up a story about Brezhnev and Kosygin. In 69, Jaffe was eased out of ABC. He was fired from his ABC job. And Mr. Scally, who was having lunch with Richard Helms and getting important information from him to make him a great newsman, then went into government service as a consultant to Richard Nixon, and then became ambassador to the United Nations. ABC pays him more than $65,000 a year. So I believe that that story in April in Esquire was the baby of the Rolling Stone story that caused Carl Bernstein, to come out with his information now on the CIA. It's interesting, I have to look up the chronology, but after this April 77 story in Esquire on the CIA and the news media, Clay Felker, formerly of the CIA, and there is no formerly, works for the Village Voice, and was eased out of that, went ahead and bought Esquire. I think of the way Ramparts broke up after it broke stories on the CIA, and I wonder if Felker's moving over and taking the Esquire magazine has anything to do with the Sam Jaffe story naming Walter Cronkite and top media people in the CIA. Well, the biggest obstacle to getting information on the John Kennedy assassination or any of the political assassinations or the mind control or any of the things that I've mentioned out to the people, because the evidence exists of these blatant conspiracies and control, is the use of journalists and radio talk shows that are controlled, like Candy Jones of the CIA, many people on KGO that work with the CIA up in San Francisco and all around the country. I'm going to read you parts of the story from Rolling Stones in case you don't have the article, just a summary of some of the collusion of the CIA with the news media. Bernstein said more than 400 American journalists work for the CIA. They've been assigned since 1952, past 25 years. And, of course, Sam Jaffe says it goes back to 47. They have all kinds of working arrangements. They have tacit agreements between each other. They have explicit agreements between the reporters and the journalists and the newspaper heads or the managers of the major TV works. They have cooperation, accommodation. They provide clandestine services of actual spying. Their reporters go around with notebooks as if they were actual reporters. They're from the CIA. The editors share their staff with the CIA. And Bernstein says that some of the most powerful organizations and individuals of American journalism are in the CIA. Harrison Salisbury, who wrote the introduction to the Warren Report, Robert Donovan, another one who wrote for the other edition of the Warren Report, the Associated Press, Henry Luce, who was very important in the Kennedy assassination, Time Life magazine, spreading stories about Lee Harvey Oswald. Bill Moyer, who's now going to work up into Cronkite's seat, who was the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson. Dan Rather, who is in Dallas, lying about the headshots of John Kennedy, saying his head went forward when it went back. United Press and Walter Cronkite, they're all listed. The CIA has posted its most valuable operatives abroad for 2 decades. High levels of the CIA deal personally with single individuals in the very top management of the newsrooms. They provide jobs and, as I say, credentials for their covers. And as Bernstein says, the best-known correspondents in the business without naming one of them in his article. He doesn't name them. Sam Jaffe did. He says the CIA news people acquire and evaluate information. They plant false information. They sign secrecy agreements and pledge never to reveal they work for the CIA. So even if they're interviewed on Meet the Press or Face the Nation or by any person who has the nerve to ask them, they have to sign a contract. The employment contract is signed, and the CIA case officer is assigned to each person, news person, and keeps control of what they're doing. George Bush, former director of the CIA, persuaded Senator Church's committee to not go into the investigation of the CIA and the American media. They deliberately misrepresented the Church hearings. They reduced the story of the CIA and news media to 9 pages of their formal report in the Church committee. I remember Senator Church said he had to close his committee quickly investigating the CIA in the United States because he wanted to run for president. A feeble excuse, particularly when Senator Church's name is very clearly defined with his biography in a little red book called Who's Who in the CIA. Therefore, you can see why he didn't describe newspapers, broadcasters, or executives with the CIA. Mr. Bader, the attorney for the Church Committee, worked for the CIA. He stopped his investigation because he was opposed to making public names of individuals. The press, the TV, newspapers, and radio all went along. When the story came out about the CIA and their mind control, It made many, many articles in the newspapers. It's still coming out. I have a box of articles to file away, massive amount. But when the Rolling Stones article came out about the journalists in the CIA, I thought I'd have another file, and I marked a box. And I brought with me 3 flimsy little articles about journalists, one defending the CIA by George Wilde called Journalists Are Citizens, and the other is New Charges Raise Old Questions About the Media, and it's in the Washington Post, which Mr. Carl Bernstein has been affiliated with for a long time, and one other little article from the New York Times quoting the Washington Post. If you notice, the editors and editorial position and the radio announcers refuse to go into that matter. You can get ad infinitum the talk shows talking about Burt Lance or the Panama Canal or some sleazy subject that they'll dwell on that isn't important. But when it came that they were being exposed themselves for their special training, they shut up like clams, and they haven't said a word about their profession being trained especially to cover the news, and particularly their role in these political assassinations, which is so flagrant, or many of the other things coming on. Bernstein said their knowledge was so heavily based on information furnished by the CIA, they didn't get the other side of the story. To rewrite the sentence, their knowledge is so heavily based on information by the CIA, they don't get the other side of the story. Bernstein said many reporters were recruited with specific undertakings and would be appalled to find out it was for the CIA, but they are listed in the CIA books. He doesn't say many reporters are recruited with specific undertakings. The entire article is put into the past tense, which makes it so dangerous. He does talk about current relationships with the CIA, that they now are stonewalling and hiding. They refuse the investigators or anybody for more information on their academic infiltration. They urge members of the CIA and the staff to not cooperate with each other, the staff not to ask questions and to curtail their inquiry, and the agents are very quiet. William Colby has been part of the suppression of this, and Mr. George Bush, former directors of the CIA. They are afraid, in quotes, that some of the biggest names in journalism would get smeared, that the disclosure of journalists on TV and radio and the news media, their highest agents, are part of sensitive, covert programs, and it's larger than indicated, Carl Bernstein keeps saying, and the Church Committee covered it up. Well, wouldn't you wonder that recent tally by the Gallup poll that more people trust Walter Cronkite than anybody else in America? How do they feel when news is written for them or slanted, and it's only one part of the story? CBS, named in this article, will be coming out with their notorious movie called Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald, based on their own admission on the Warren Report. The Warren Report was so sleazy that 10 years ago only 80% of the country disbelieved it, and now there's 175 books critical of the Warren Report and their investigation. So they go back to a book that was written in 1964 that's out of print, and CBS continues this cover-up. The Senate committee was supposed to investigate these matters, and they didn't do it, and they didn't allow the full committee to see the documents. They had a little private huddle, and their excuse was that leaks would be explosive, that leaks are the biggest fear. When the Church Committee was working, and Gary Hart, who was called the conscience of the Senate, who's now dead, said that the covert relations of the United States media hardly reflected what we found when we got into it. He said there was a prolonged and elaborate negotiation with the CIA over what would be said outside the committee, and Gary Hart saw some of the little goodies, but he hasn't lived to tell us about it. The Senate covered up not only 400 of the names, but they gave out about 50 contacts of journalists that were sanitized. Mr. Colby gave misleading statements, and still does, about the journalists. They're repeated without any contradiction or elaboration. The news media has cooperated by not going into the story any further, and the CIA continues to regard the press as up for grabs. Carl Bernstein did say that in his article. He said they continue to think the press is up for grabs. I think it's important in this country whether we will be able to get the voice of the people expressed, get information out to them, or whether the CIA is going to continuously disguise their agents. If they say, is a certain person an agent, they have methods of disguise which are listed in the Rolling Stones article. They have contract employees, plain agents, agents with control capability, agents of opportunity, stringers, accredited correspondents, editorial employees, general circulation editors, freelance writers, reporters. If you ask them, is he a freelance, they can say, no, he's a stringer. If you say, do you have any stringers, they say, no, we have reporters. And the beat goes on. It's obvious that the media isn't allowed to tell the truth, and the Senate isn't allowed to tell the truth, and the committee was folded up when it got started. Gary Hart is dead, and Senator Church is on the CIA himself. But that's why we have Dialogue Conspiracy, to get some facts about these assassinations and criminal activities to the people, and hopefully we can just keep rolling around with information. But do get some of these articles, the one on George DeMohrenschildt by Mark Lane, and the Philadelphia one, the We magazine, and the Mormons. They're very important, and the New Times on Alger, and read them, because they come and go. They go off the stands, and they're very, very valuable articles, and there's a lot of good work being done. So you do your homework, and I'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy, and maybe we'll go into some of those articles in detail.